In this video, I'd like to introduce you to a new product that we're rolling out called DDC, which is short for Dedicated Device Control. Before showing you how this product works, I'll give you some background into what inspired it. The first inspiration came from hardware synthesizers with lots of physical controls, so lots of sliders, knobs, buttons, and switches. Devices like these are essentially two components. You have the sound source, the synthesizer, and then a control surface for that sound source. This way, whenever you want to use the sound source, you have controls to manipulate it. And of course, that's very useful. Given the state of technology these days, we should be able to do the same sort of thing with software synthesizers. So we should be able to choose a soft synth to use and dedicate a MIDI controller to controlling that soft synth. The second inspiration came from digital mixers. On many, if not most digital mixers, you'll find that each channel has relatively few controls. The majority of the parameters for each channel, things like compressor settings and EQ settings, are all edited from a centralized place. So you basically have one set of controls for editing whichever channel is selected. Again, we should be able to do this sort of thing in software. So we should be able to choose which devices we want to have for each channel or each track, and then choose which MIDI controller we want to use to control those devices. So these are the sorts of problems that DDC was designed to handle. Now you might think, well, wait a minute, I can kind of already do this sort of thing with MIDI mapping in Live. And it's true, you can kind of already do it, with the emphasis there being on kind of. To better illustrate that point, I'm going to compare the two methods so that you can see for yourself the difference. Alright, and for this demonstration, I'm going to be using the Novation launch control, but I want to stress that DDC is compatible with virtually any MIDI controller. So having said all that, let's jump in. Alright, so let's take a look at doing this with MIDI mapping. In order to use a controller for MIDI mapping, you'll need to turn on the remote switch for the controller's input. If the controller has LEDs that can be remotely controlled, you'll also want to turn on the remote switch for the controller's output. If the controller has knobs or faders with a fixed range of motion, you'll also want to select the takeover mode other than none. This prevents jumps in values when the value of the parameter differs from the value of the control that you're controlling it with. Let's take a look at an example of controlling an instrument. For this, we'll use analog. I'll simply go into MIDI mapping mode, select a parameter that I want to control, and then turn or press the control that I want to control it with. I'll use the left side of controls to control oscillator 1. Then I'll use the right side to control the same parameters but for oscillator 2. Alright, so this was easy to set up, and it seems to work, so why not just stick with this? Well, there's several reasons. This particular controller has multicolored LEDs, and that can be useful in cases like this for identifying what the buttons are controlling. MIDI mapping doesn't allow us to take advantage of that. As you can see here, all the LEDs are simply yellow. A more significant problem is that this mapping only pertains to this instance of analog. If I switch to another track and insert analog there, I won't be able to control it. I can only control that first instance. Now some controllers, such as this one, allow you to have multiple pages of assignments, so it is possible to set up another page to control a second instance of analog. But that would get really messy. And another problem with that is that Live's takeover function depends on the fact that a control always sends the same MIDI message. Alright, if it sends different MIDI messages, as would be the case if you had multiple pages set up, then Live's takeover system won't work and you'll get a bunch of jumps in values. Here's an example of using MIDI mapping for controlling a channel strip, where you'd likely want to control multiple devices. Again, this works, but it has the same problems that we saw with the analog mapping. And now let's take a look at doing this with DDC. First, we'll select one of the DDC scripts. There's 6 of them, and we'll talk about why that is in a future video. But for now, let's just select the first one, and we'll select our controller as the input and output. Now we'll use the DDC editor to assign parameters to our controls. First, we'll edit the device list to add analog so that we can control it. Now for our encoders, otherwise known as knobs, we can select analog as the device and the parameter within analog that we want the knob to control. Editing buttons is similar. We still select the device to control as well as the parameter, but we also have a button type option where you can select either toggle or momentary. And then we have fields for LED values. This allows us to take advantage of multicolored LEDs. The assignments we have here are exactly the same as the assignments we use with MIDI mapping, but with some very significant differences. As you can see, the LEDs of the buttons are different colors. This helps indicate what the buttons do. Also, this mapping is dynamic, so if we move to another track and insert an instance of analog, we can control it right away. In fact, we can control an unlimited number of instances, and we never have to switch between templates, which means Live's takeover system is able to do its job and will never run into jumps in value. Setting up the channel strip is pretty much the same, except that we'll have 3 devices in our device list. Then when we go to edit our controls, you'll see that we have 3 devices to choose from. As I mentioned before, you can use virtually any MIDI controller with DDC. However, you may need to edit the controller's MIDI assignments or edit a definitions file in order to use your controller with DDC. To make that easier, we've created an online repository. You can find a variety of useful files here, including pre-configured files for various controllers. Also, we've made DDC quite open so that it can be extended and specialized for particular controllers. You can see some of the existing extensions here. Here's an example of using an on-screen display to show which parameter each control on a controller is assigned to.